For many, the 2006 release of Ace Combat Zero: The Balkan War marks the end of an era. More specifically, the end of the PlayStation 2 era of Ace Combat games that so many of us hold dear to our hearts. But what if I told you
there is another,
somewhat lesser known title in the series that warrants just as much attention as those other beloved titles? Enter Ace Combat X: Skies of Deception. Also released in 2006, the game was available on Sony's handheld system, the PSP, which is probably the reason why many folks like myself never had the chance to play it. If you didn't have the system, there was just no way to actually play the game. Now, the good news is, here in the year 2024, we have this little thing called emulation that makes titles like these, which would otherwise be near impossible to play, playable. Hell, the game even has an HD texture pack available for it that really sharpens up certain areas that I would highly recommend. So, what exactly is Ace Combat X, and how does it fit into the world of Strange Reel? Well, if I had to give a TLDR description for someone who had never played it, and by the way, this was my first time ever playing it, I'd say it reminds me of a trimmed down Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies, with a couple of key differences. And yes, while part of the story is told in a similar fashion, with still images that are narrated over, that isn't the only reason I draw the comparison. It's more than that. The feel of gameplay, flight models, menus, and more just really give me Ace Combat 4 vibes. But I mentioned differences, and there are a couple of things that really make this one stand apart from not just Shattered Skies, but from many of the other titles that released for the PS2. In order to talk about them though, we'll first need to dive into the game's story. The story of Skies of Deception takes place in 2020, just 1 year after the events of Ace Combat 7: Skies Unknown. We find ourselves on the continent of South Osea this time around during a conflict known as the Aurelian War, which features the nations of Aurelia and Laysath. Prior to the events of the game, a civil war broke out in the latter mentioned nation as a result of economic collapse. The exact details on the end of the Civil War aren't known, but it is known that General Diego Gaspar Navarro seemed to suddenly rise to power around this time, becoming the de facto head of state and commanding officer of the Democratic Republic of Laysath. Shortly after his rise to power, Navarro publicly spoke out against Aurelia, claiming that his country's recent economic issues were due to years of exploitation at the hands of their neighbors, which was an odd thing to say since Aurelia had been providing relief efforts to the war-torn country throughout the entirety of their civil war. Navarro's bold claim is followed up by a blitzkrieg-style attack that sees almost the entire nation of Aurelia fall within mere days. Laysath then goes to make a final decisive blow against Aurelia by destroying Aubrey Air Force Base by means of a B-52 squadron, which, if successful, would all but prevent the Aurelians from being able to fight back. And this is where we come in, because it's essentially custom at this point for the first mission of an Ace Combat game to involve shooting down defenseless bombers. We take on the role of Griffiths 1, the head of Griffiths Squadron, as we sortie out to down the incoming B-52s. As expected, they don't put up much of a fight. What happens next though took me by a bit of a surprise, as I normally expect Ace Combat games to sort of ease me into the narrative before anything crazy happens. Yep, not this time. After thinking we've saved the day by downing the enemy bomber squadron, a SWBM, or Shockwave Ballistic Missile, shows up, having been fired from the Laysathian superweapon known as the Glepnir, a massive aerial fortress that has the ability to cloak itself and extend air superiority into large areas. Almost our entire squadron is destroyed, setting up a pretty grim picture for the beginning of the game, and clearly identifying the big bad weapon that we will most certainly be destroying later on. Moving forward, Griffith's squadron works to assist the Aurelian forces in pushing back against the invaders, and fairly early on we see something that's super cool about this game's campaign and something that I would love to see in future Ace Combat titles: branching mission paths and mission selections. With very few exceptions, almost the entire time you're making your way through the game's campaign, you're offered choices in how you want to proceed with mission selection and order. These choices can drastically change certain aspects of gameplay in future missions, or alter parts of them entirely. I'll give you a couple of examples I noticed throughout my 2 playthroughs of the game. In my first playthrough, I elected to not do a mission that would allow me to disable an enemy jamming system, and as a result, missions past that point in that section of the game were plagued by an annoying ECM effect, where my locks would, every few seconds, be broken. In my second playthrough, I did this mission, which was pretty cool, might I add. Having to follow power lines through a snowy landscape to destroy power plants that cut off the system's defenses before finally being able to take them out was a unique experience that not only was fun to do, but also greatly assisted in later missions by not having to deal with that ECM effect. The next example takes place in the game's final act, where the player is clearly given a decision to make in how they want to approach the game's finale. After defeating the Gleipnir and retaking the Aurelian capital city of Griswold, we learn that Navarro and his forces have another superweapon at their disposal that poses a serious threat, the Fenrir, a highly advanced fighter that shares advanced technologies with the Gleipnir, such as the ability to cloak itself and a scaled-down version of the SWBM. There was also a microwave weapon in development that could be used in conjunction with stations on the ground to generate a ball of intense, plasma-like energy that can hone in on enemy aircraft, causing them to overheat and the fuel contained within them to explode. When we learn of the Fenrir and that it's being housed at Arkalong Fortress, the sort of last bastion of defense for the Laysath forces, we also learn that the elite Alex Squadron is most likely en route to the base to pilot the Fenrir, which could really be a disaster if allowed to happen. In the hands of these ace pilots, the experimental aircraft could be essentially unstoppable. At the same time, however, we also learn of Cobalt Cave, a research development facility that houses the microwave system to be equipped on the Fenrir. This presents the player with a choice. We can either engage the enemy ace squadron, preventing them from getting into the cockpits of the Fenrirs, or stop the experimental weapon system from being delivered that would complete the Fenrir's armament. The decision you make will drastically change the way the final mission plays out. In my first run through, I elected to stop the enemy ace squadron from getting their hands on Fenrir, and as a result, had to deal with the microwave weapon system in the final mission. Granted, the Fenrirs themselves were less of a threat due to their lower skilled pilots, but it still presented a different sort of challenge since the microwave system prevents you from flying slowly in a dogfight. Also, this rendition of the final mission had a distinct lack of flying inside an internal structure to finish out the game, which sort of felt a little wrong, you know? The second time around, I allowed Alex Squadron to get to the Fenrirs, and yes, while they didn't have their fancy microwave ball of death, it was still an absolute hell of a fight. We'll touch on it a little more later, but the difficulty in AI in this game is kinda nuts, and these guys are the representation of that difficulty. On Ace, this was a serious challenge. I was happy to see too that after finally dealing with Alex Squadron, a rogue Fenrir was taking off from inside the facility that needed taking out, requiring me to do a little bit of that internal structure flying that we all know and love before finally wrapping up the game. In my opinion, this version of the final mission felt like the game's true ending, and after checking out the Ace Combat wiki page, my suspicions were confirmed as it does appear that this is the canon ending for the game. Now, while the story of the game is playing out as you're moving across the South Ocean continent, there's an additional narrative told by someone that you might just recognize, Albert Jeanette. If the name isn't familiar, he's the reporter from Ace Combat 5. In Skies of Deception, he's been tasked with reporting on the Aurelian War, and occasionally there will be a cutscene that plays with him doing narration over still images similar to the style of the story from Ace Combat 4. Unfortunately, the style of presentation is about the only thing shared with the PS2 title, as there really isn't that much depth or emotion to the story. Don't go into it expecting something that has the quality or emotion of the telling of the story that involved the boy in Yellow 13. While seeing Jeanette return was cool, and the cutscenes provided a nice break in the action here and there, they weren't the strong point of this one, and they didn't really add too much to the story in my opinion. Now, don't let that make you think the story of the game is bad, it's just that the telling of the story in this one primarily takes place via briefings and actually playing through missions themselves, rather than the cutscenes in between them. The fact that there are so many different paths to take really make this one you're going to want to play through at least 2 times, with a third playthrough being required to see every possible mission variation. And although 3 playthroughs seems a little intimidating, the game is pretty short, with a run through of the entire campaign being able to be completed in less than 4 hours. Now that we've touched on the game's story, let's talk a little about gameplay and its feel. How does the Ace Combat series translate to the PSP? Well, pretty well I'd say. Honestly, if it wasn't for the frame rate, I'd have a hard time discerning it from one of the PS2 titles. Clocking in at 30 FPS on the PSP, it effectively has half the frame rate of its Holy Trinity cousins, which initially was pretty jarring, but I got used to it pretty quickly. Gameplay-wise, things feel, for the most part, just like the PS2 entries in the series, although I'll say that the flight models remind me most of Ace Combat 4. There are a couple of small differences though, like the way guns work. Here, when your gun reticle gets close to an enemy, it has this sort of lock-on effect where it'll lock onto the enemy and guarantee hits while you're firing. I noticed though that sometimes when I was firing my guns and not in that locked-on state, even if my guns should have been hitting, they just wouldn't. I don't know if this is an emulator issue or if anyone else has dealt with it, but it was a little annoying at times. It just seemed like the gun's hit detection wasn't the greatest. Missiles also felt slightly different compared to other titles in the series. I'm not sure if they travel faster or have slightly worse tracking, but they definitely felt slightly off. There were times when I was certain that a missile would hit and it would end up missing, particularly up against close enemies or in head-on scenarios. Missiles fired from enemies seemed harder to dodge at times as well. There were times when I would have a missile alert and be in a turn, thinking I'm safe, just to get nailed. Speed was much more important to keep up while turning in order to dodge successfully than I was accustomed to. The game features a pretty impressive roster of aircraft to unlock, with all your favorites returning. There's also the inclusion of fictional aircraft into the roster as well, with many seeming like they would fit right into the world of Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere. Now initially, when looking at the stats of some of these aircraft, they don't really seem all that impressive when compared to the stats of the real aircraft that are in the game, but there's a reason why that's the case. Skies of Deception features unlockable parts and tuning, allowing you to customize aircraft and make them your own. But there's a caveat: you can only tune the fictional aircraft. Through these parts, you're able to make adjustments to your plane's handling, power, weapons payload, and more. Limiting customization to just a fictional aircraft was a good way to keep the real-life aircraft balance, but also allow players to create something to their own liking that could still be just as, if not more effective than some of the more powerful aircraft in the game. Personally, I stuck to real aircraft for the majority of my playthrough until I unlocked the Wyvern, which I felt really was necessary to deal with the game on Ace difficulty. Which, yeah, let's talk difficulty. I completed 2 playthroughs, one on hard and one on Ace. This game is challenging, much more so than most other Ace Combat games I've played. Actually, looking back on it, it might be the hardest title I've played in the series. SAMs wrecked me, enemy aircraft wrecked me, ships wrecked me. Oh, and my favorite death of all, when I finally completed the final mission for the first time, I crashed right into the ground, just as mission accomplished scrolled across my screen, and had to restart from the beginning. So yes, even the ground wrecked me. So yeah, the game's challenging. Playing this on an emulator, I can only imagine it was easier than it would be playing on an actual PSP. Having access to a full-size controller and playing on a bigger screen certainly took away some of the difficulty factor. I'd like to add too that since I only did 2 playthroughs, I wasn't able to unlock and take part in Operation X, which is a special gauntlet-like stage you gain access to for completing all the game's missions. I can only imagine how challenging it would be to complete on Ace, let alone S rank. If you're interested in playing the game though, I wouldn't let the difficulty deter you. You'll have no problem completing it on normal, but things do get challenging when you bump it up to harder Ace, just be aware. Okay, let's talk audio now. We're gonna break this up into 2 sections: music and then everything else. The game's music is good. It's not my favorite from the series, but it definitely does the job, with certain tracks going along perfectly with the missions or scenarios they accompany. It has this sort of techno or more upbeat vibe going on that reminds me a bit of Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere. Here's some snippets from one of my favorites, End of Deception. Now, the rest of the audio in the game definitely leaves a little something to be desired, but I'm not entirely sure if it's the game's fault or just a limitation of the hardware. It definitely sounds a bit overly compressed at times, but honestly, it wasn't a huge deal. Some of the voice acting though was just, let's just say this is what peak radio chatter in an Ace Combat game sounds like.
To all Allied forces, this is the Naiad. This is the Naiad. We've reached the target. This is the Naiad. Take care of those birds in the sky.
This is the Naiad. This is the Naiad. Hull breach.
This is the Naiad. We're taking fire from enemy aircraft.
Overall, I quite enjoyed Ace Combat X. It was definitely a pleasant surprise for me being on a handheld originally. I just wasn't quite too sure what to expect going into it. Sure, it was a little short, but I much prefer that to something that overstays its welcome with crappy, drawn-out gameplay. Is it on the same level of quality as the PS2 titles? Maybe not quite, but if you're a fan of their style of gameplay, I 100% would recommend checking out X. I think you'll enjoy it. Let me know your thoughts on the game down below. I'd love to hear where you rank this one compared to the other games in the series. This is Jarbo Gaming. As always, we'll see you on the next one.